Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Standards Committee. As I've had apologies from the Chair, Councillor Shiraz Khan, who's been able to attend. First order on the agenda is the appointment of Chair, and Councillor Matthew Holmes has put himself forward, so if you was all in agreement, I'll hand over to you then, Chair.
Thank you. Welcome to the Standard Planning Committee on 1st of November. I think we also have apologies from Councillor Heselgrave. Right, so late items to be introduced by the Chair, which is agenda item 2. I'm not aware of any. Item 3, as always, declarations of interest. Any members, attendees have any declarations of interest to announce? No? Thank you. Item 4 is to approve the minutes or note the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of August 2022. If anyone has any comments on those, otherwise we will note them. Agree? Okay, so item 5 on the agenda is Standards Committee Forward Plan. Alex?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is the forward plan that the Standards Committee maintains. It is just an opportunity for members of the committee to request items, business for future meetings, which we can take away and prepare a report for. On the agenda this evening is the report on best practice guidance for councillors on use of social media. And I think for future meetings, we have a review of the councillor officer protocol and also the protocol on facilities, services and equipment. So if any councillors or independent members would like to add anything to the forward plan, they can either agree that here or they can contact myself outside of this meeting. We can Chair.
Does anybody have any suggestions for the forward plan above and beyond what Alex has put forward this time?
It's not a suggestion, thank you, Chair. But just in relation to those items which are on future agendas. So the working together council officer protocol on the 24th of January and the protocol on use of facilities, services and equipment by councillors on the 21st of March. I wondered if there was any merit maybe in us asking all members if they had any comments or thoughts on either of those protocols, so those thoughts could be brought to this meeting when we discuss those protocols, and if that's something that committee agrees with, that's something that we can facilitate through member service, democratic services.
Sounds, Emily, that sounds a great idea. I think for White Level, everyone agreed that we should do that. We take that back.
It might be worth asking councillors whether they existing councillors whether there's anything they felt they could have done better if they'd known about it in advance. You know,
okay.
Those retiring councillors, for instance, you know, not been around well. You know.
Okay.
just thought really.
Right, thank you. One of the sorry.
Yes, a different sort of question. I seem to recall that it must be 2 or 3 years ago now that the Local Government Association instituted a period of consultation with local councils, and I know the Standards Committee here considered various ideas and put forward some proposals, suggestions in relation to the draft that they produced. Now, subsequently, has that process come to an end? Because with the updating of the Code of Conduct here, or are there any still outlying features of that process which are still under discussion?
Alex?
Just for clarification, under discussion internally to Derby City Council or more broadly with the LGA?
With the LGA, it was a national process, and I had the impression that probably we've come to the end of that, but I just wanted to ask whether there are any aspects to that which are ongoing, or have we now at DCC come to the end of the road and we've now got an established newly revised Council's Code of Conduct, which I see includes the aspects of LGA guidance, which I commented on the last meeting, was I thought very useful actually.
The LGA published their model code of conduct. It would have been around 12 months ago now, if I recall correctly, and we have since incorporated directly in full. I think at the time we agreed that we didn't want to go down that route. We thought there were some aspects of our councillors' code of conduct that were specific to our particular circumstances in Derby, and there were elements that we wanted to retain. But in terms of the review of the code of conduct, I think that is concluded. However, the broader programme that the LGA are undertaking, which is their civility in public life programme, which that review of the code of conduct fed into, that's an ongoing programme for the LGA, and they continue to publish resources and information in relation to that broader piece, I suppose. And that feeds in nicely to the item that we'll discuss shortly on the social media protocol, because that's part of that programme as well.
One thing that I would just ask really of officers, do we have a point where we review the process that Emily and other officers go through in terms of referral complaints or outcomes of complaints to the relevant group leaders and that protocol, you know, where we have almost like the flow chart? You know, are we at any point going to just make sure we review that to make sure it's fit for purpose, and maybe if there's any amendments or alterations to that to make the process either better or take on board feedback? Because it's been probably, is it 3 or 4 years now that's been in place?
Well, the new process was introduced, I think it was 2018, but we did review it, if you recall, 18 to probably 2 years ago now, because we realised it had a flaw. If you recall, that the new process set out what would happen up until the point that you got to moving into a hearing, and then was silent on how a hearing would be conducted. So we then had it reviewed externally to inform that section of it. So that process has actually been relatively recently reviewed, and during at that time, you know, an overview review was undertaken. So that process is relatively recently reviewed, you know, but I think it would be sensible for us to build into our forward planning a point in which it's regularly reviewed, either internally or, you know, having the benefit of someone external just casting an eye over it to make sure it reflects good practice. Alex, if you have anything to add to that?
No, I'd agree with that, Emily. And I think our current forward plan takes up to the end of this municipal year. We'd then be looking at sort of early in 2023 municipal year, which would take us probably 2 years beyond when the change is introduced, which would seem like a sensible place to review that. It's called for the consideration of complaints. So happily add that to the forward plan for early in the next new municipal year, if members agree.
Yeah, I think that would be sensible. Obviously, we don't want to be prescriptive about it needs to be reviewed every municipal year, but I think that would be good to do that. Next, officers can sort that out.
Yeah, I think both myself and Alex are keen that we keep all of our codes and protocols under regular review. That's part of the reason for having the forward plan come to this committee, is that it's much better to have those documents under regular review rather than not touching them for years and then having to do a full wholesale rewrite, you know, periodically. So we would rather keep them under review.
I mean, fundamentally, I think it's sound, isn't it? I think that's been proven the case. But obviously, it would be sensible just to review it every so often. But we'll leave that, if everyone's okay, in officers' hands. And if the suggestion from Alex is agreeable to officers, then put that in your little work programme and you can have a look at it.
Just one other thing, that the thing about training to be added to the forward plan, presumably that would be sensible to review that before the elections next year.
Yes, I mean, I don't know, officers, is there a spike? Is it naive to say there isn't one when it comes to elections in terms of complaints? Is it something where you receive more, or is it, you know, is there any benefit of training before a campaign starts?
I have to say, so when I first came into this post, in the run up to that election, we got a lot. I did get a lot of reports, and, you know, fairly petty stuff in the main of sort of, you know, tit for tat type complaints. I don't know if that was because I think previous incumbent in this post had sort of encouraged a lot of reporting. But we dealt with that. But actually, over recent elections, I've seen less of that, actually. But I think we're more proactive in talking to members at the councillor briefings in terms of the run up to the PERDA period, in terms of what's acceptable, what isn't acceptable, reminding councillors of what is good practice and what isn't. And I don't know if that has been the reason for it, but we have generally seen less complaints coming through in that run up to election period. So I wouldn't say we've seen a spike at all in recent years. So Stephen, would you confirm?
Yeah. Probably it's a valid point though. I think the point is to if there is guidance and training available, then it's probably prudent to put it before an election campaign. But obviously officers need to just deal with their workload, and reports and guidance can't be rushed. If it's not ready, then obviously it wouldn't be able to be presented, but it could be maybe form part of that whole process of advice and meetings that you have with candidates and those that are around.
Yeah, we will continue to run the training the updates on the pre-election period that we give to all members. I think we did that last year. I think it worked quite well. Do it again. We do the same training for officers as well, so that they're aware. So we spot the potential banana skins before, so we don't organise things at the wrong time and things like that. And we have, obviously, as part of the training that we run for candidates, we pick it up as well.
Okay. I mean, to give you some reassurance, because we're heading towards an all-out election, every single councillor is going to now be told it's almost mandatory to go to the training and the guidance. So your
candidates training.
Yeah. So your suggestion is almost going to happen anyway. Well, will happen because every single council will be involved in that process.
I was just presumably it also will include the social media thing. That's not.
We will pick that up.
Yeah, and we've got the next item on that.
Exactly. Well, I was thinking that's something that maybe we hasn't. I don't know if it was in previously. It would need to be in subsequently.
Yeah. Well, we'll probably hear about the time frame of that in the next item, and then if that. Yeah, I do know that there is guidance on social media, even without the policy the guidance. Sorry, that we're going to talk about shortly. Yeah. That is obviously a growing aspect of the, should we say, a very strong advice that's offered to both candidates and councillors who are going to be candidates leading to any election period and in general, but more to come on the next item. Alex.
I think also with this item that's been added to the full plan around mandatory and discretionary training for councillors, I don't think it solely relates to the training that's delivered in the run up to elections to candidates. Clearly, with there being the point you've already made, Chair, but with there being all out elections in May, and anecdotally, we're aware that there are quite a few long-standing councillors who are planning to stand down at that election. It is likely that we're going to have a large cohort of newly elected councillors, and therefore that training need is going to perhaps be greater. So I think there's a piece of work that we need to do in terms of looking at what are the bits of training that we say are compulsory for councillors, what are the things that are advisory, how do we go about delivering that. In the last couple of years, we've done that online. Prior to that, we've had individual councillor training days. I think there's probably a discussion to be had about what is most suitable for members' needs and what specifically is it we consider to be mandatory training for councillors. So that's something we could broaden out, and certainly something we could bring back to this committee in due course.
Yes, it's a good point actually. Again,
that's what I was thinking about. Yeah.
Not only a 51 up. But there is going to be a lot of churn in terms of long-standing councillors that are not going to be standing for re-election. Therefore, a lot of new people coming in that I'm sure of be very competent. However, it would be very useful to ensure that they have the guidance and training early on to ensure that they understand the code of conduct and their responsibilities as elected members of this council. So, okay, that's great.
I mean, if it helps, I'm sure. I could help if you want to, Peter or anybody else, or any of us, if you think it would be useful. Otherwise, just to say this is what an independent person is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Okay. Anything else on that item? Okay. So item 6, social media best practice for councillors. Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. This was something that was discussed at the last meeting of the Standards Committee and also feeds into, I suppose, a broader discourse in local government at the moment around councillors' use of social media, both in terms of the risks that exist for councillors when they use social media and the sort of personal safety aspects of it as well. So hopefully the report's fairly self-explanatory and builds on the discussion that we started at the last meeting. Hopefully an opportunity for those councillors in the room to discuss their own experiences using social media and how that can inform some of our future practice, and inform as well how we develop some of those codes and protocols that Emily referred to just now. So specifically our council code of conduct, our member officer protocol, and our protocol on use of facility services and equipment, which all three of which this committee is responsible for reviewing periodically. As I mentioned, there's an extensive national debate on civility in public life, I suppose, which led to the adoption of the Local Government Association's Model Code of Conduct. And prior to that, the best practice recommendations of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, both of which this committee has previously examined. I think social media is probably an important part of that discourse. It's transformed the way elected representatives can engage with those people they represent, and it carries with it some substantial risks. The report breaks down those risks into two categories. Firstly, there's the risks to the safety and well-being of councillors, I suppose, posed by social media, which was demonstrated by the LGA's recent survey of councillors nationally entitled Debate Not Hate. Worryingly, a significant proportion of councillors have experienced abuse via social media, and that survey revealed evidence about the expectation on councillors that they're available 24 hours a day to members of the public, and the blurred lines between personal and professional spaces. And on the back of that evidence, the Local Government Association has published a range of helpful materials as part of its digital citizenship programme that's summarised at paragraph 4.4 of the report. But ultimately, nationally, if we fail to tackle these issues, it has a debilitating impact on the viability of our democracy, I suppose. If people don't want to become councillors or aren't sufficiently protected from abuse and intimidation, then obviously we're not going to have the best possible candidates to stand for election and represent people. So as I mentioned, interested to hear the experiences of councillors as part of any discussion we have this evening. The second aspect of the report are the reputational and legal risks that pose to councillors and the organisations they represent, caused by improper use of social media. Interestingly, we've seen in recent years around a third of complaints relate in one form or another to use of social media. These can range from anything from disagreements with residents online, arguments between two councillors that take place on social media, disagreements over access to closed Facebook groups, that kind of thing. So there's lots of scope for members to fall foul of the code of conduct if social media sites aren't used responsibly, I guess. There's a need for councillors to be aware of some specific legal issues applicable to both themselves and residents, which are summarised at paragraph 4.5. So, for example, the law around defamation, harassment, malicious communication, and to emphasise as well that both the council and the police take those matters really seriously if they are reported. So to encourage councillors, if they encounter situations where they do feel they are being subject to harassment and abuse, to tell us about it. We maintain a log of those inquiries which come to us, but in the first instance they should be reported to the police. I think an important thing to stress is that councillors are held to a higher standard of behaviour than members of the public when conducting themselves online. And so obviously councillors are subject to the Councillors' Code of Conduct when they are perceived to be acting in an official capacity. And I think when using social media, and you have to remember that you are publishing information in a public forum, and it's then very difficult to argue that you're not acting in your capacity as a councillor, especially if your online profile makes that fact known. So if you say that you are a councillor on your online profile, then anything you say on that profile is you acting in that capacity. The report sets out some specific risks around predetermination and bias. So obviously councillors need to take care about what they disclose online if they are subsequently to participate in a decision. Obviously you're entitled to be predisposed to a particular view, but you have a duty to enter a meeting with an open mind. Again, it's challenging to maintain that position if you've made a definitive statement on your social media profile before a meeting takes place. So the recommendations in this report are left deliberately fairly open-ended. It's for the committee to share their experiences debate and determine the extent to which we think Derby City Council should have its own policy or procedure applicable to councillors. I think it's important to stress that we don't want to be prescriptive, particularly about what we say councillors can or can't do. That's already encapsulated within the code of conduct, but I think there perhaps is scope for some guidance that could be issued to councillors more generally. So I'd ask the committee to consider how to share that best practice with councillors and whether we need some sort of specific protocol. There is some reference to social media already included within the code of conduct, but I think there is opportunity for that to be developed further perhaps. And also it could be included as part of a future review of the councillor officer protocol and also the protocol on facility services and equipment, as we've already heard, both of which are included in the forward plan. Thank you, Chair. That's everything. I'm happy to open the floor to some debate and take any questions you'd like to do.
Thank you, Alex. I think this is something which is an essential piece of work for the council officers to develop. Before I open to the floor, certainly many of the aspects there do need guidance or a policy. I think we should leave that open to officers to explore, because we do have to remember that we already have an overarching code of conduct, and there are going to be elements of this which are clearly guidance rather than you must or you must not, because there will be a censure either way. It's not going to be as simple as that in some cases because of the overarching code of conduct and also the limitations of the standards process as well. So absolutely happy with the recommendations being more open-ended, and I would ask that we look at the LGA, we look at other councils to see what they're developing, speak to our independent members, and also maybe gain views from councillors themselves as well, the wider cohort, to formulate guidance and or a policy if that's appropriate. Does anyone have any views on this? Because obviously it's such well, we all use social media. Certainly, I think most councillors here, I'm aware of, I don't think anyone's not online. And it's little nuances such as when you're acting as a councillor, when you feel you're not acting as a councillor. You just explained very clearly there, Alex, that you may feel that you're making a statement or you're saying something in a personal capacity. Well, actually, you won't be. So I think that side of things as well would probably be very useful for councillors to understand. Does anyone have any comments, any areas they'd like to discuss on this one?
Yep.
Councillor Graves.
Excellent. I do wonder about how standards is going to deal with this. How many, Emily's sort of alluded to the fact that a third of complaints about social media about councillors. How many have been progressed and actually come to a decision in favour of the complainant? None. So therefore, it makes me wonder how effective any of this guidance, as you call it, is in council terms. We have a lot of officer time spent on creating these policies, and you know, even the proper complaints, very few come to any fruition, and there's nothing you can do about the councillor, which is a bit of a shame, really. And I'm including people that complain about me. You know, they've all come to no conclusion at the end, and so it makes me wonder about the time that council officers spend on creating this when there's nothing you can do about it anyway. This is a pretty good report. It's okay as it is. On the other hand, I actually think that it exposes councillors quite a lot, whereas in the general public, without social media, before social media, you might get a reporter that reports something you said to get you into trouble. Now it's very easy to get yourself into trouble because you can spout off on social media and say anything you want, and that can get you into trouble. And quite honestly, if a councillor doesn't understand that, then, you know, so be it, and they should not be a councillor, in my view. You know, you've got to take some responsibility for what you put on social media. We're no principles. The principles are exactly the same as in normal life. You know, if we're not allowed to defame people, we're not allowed to abuse people, we're not allowed to do all sorts of things. You know, if you can't be a reasonable person, then this it's just the same, but this does expose them, and it's quite interesting how some councillors have been caught out, but still get away with it because there's no teeth to the policy. I have been abused several times on social media, and it's usually just people that just don't agree with you, and they just try and abuse you. It's quite funny. As my personality allows me to contain that, because I think it's them that's got the problem, not me. We should be able to debate things. We should be able to have a difference of opinion. I love differences of opinion, but some people don't. If you don't agree with them, they shout at you and swear at you and all sorts. And I find that quite amusing. I have quite a few people that are blocked on my phone because they message me. They used to message me a lot. I have to say most of them are Labour Party members, but that's by the by. So there are methods of stopping people. You can block people on your social media accounts. And so, you should take advantage of that if you feel you're being abused. But if you're too weak to deal with it, then you shouldn't be a councillor, or you should come on social media, whichever you prefer.
Fair enough. Can I just answer a couple of things? I think I don't think this process should be focused on censure. So I think for me, it's all about guidance, quality advice, and especially some of the nuances. Alex has suggested, quite rightly, that the use of social media can have an impact, if you will say, on the planning committee. And it would be useful. I mean, there is training there for people who are on those kind of committees where you must retain an open mind. I think that is useful, and I think that could be something which would be within this guidance, which would be helpful towards councillors understanding that process and how they have to be careful. The third thing I think is about potential abuse of a councillor in terms of online abuse or whatever in that nature. I think that is something which could actually form part of this as well, to help councillors to have guidance on what to do in any given circumstances as well. So it's not a case of wrapping people up in cotton wool, Alan. We know that. You've got to use your brain.
I advocate the opposite.
Engage brain before
Exactly.
speaking, engage brain before posting something, and if you want to be a councillor, you have to have that level of common sense, because you're not going to last very long otherwise. So I get that, but I think there's still value here in terms of maybe not thinking of it about the process of censure and complaints, but actually wider guidance. Councillor Atwell.
Totally agree, Chair. But I mean, we're in a bit of a no-win situation because we've all got our best interests of the ward at heart. But unfortunately, you're always going to get a minority who don't agree with it. But their way of getting their message across to you is being abusive on social media. So, sometimes, like you said, yeah, you're right. We're talking in that capacity as a non-council. But if you've got your name like a council attached to it, you're automatically going to fall into that bracket. So, as much as I agree with everything you're saying, where do we stand? I mean, Alex, as you know, to send you an email regarding one individual. Somebody's bombarding them, they're getting racially abusive. But that's just unfair, because all we're trying to do is look after the best interest. And at the end of the day, yourself, you've got a big one. We're not just there to look after one individual. The ward's a lot bigger than one individual or one organisation. So it's, as much as it works, I think we're always going to be, our backs are always going to be up against what when it comes to social media. What we try to get out there, unfortunately for a few, they don't agree with it, so therefore they feel they have the right. And then again, we can't respond to that, because then all of a sudden we're in an argument, and you can't win, can you?
Yeah, and I think there's, again, going back to, we shouldn't be wrapped in cotton wool. Councillors put themselves out there, as community leaders and elected representatives, and with that comes responsibility, and with that comes, I'm afraid you have to have
broad shoulders,
because people won't agree with you all the time. And I think it's safe to say that a face-to-face meeting with a resident, or in a forum capacity or a surgery capacity, can be very, very different to an interaction on social media, especially on a more open platform, with comments and that kind of thing. And I think I know there's residents have actually said that they're a little bit embarrassed about what they said online when they meet you face-to-face. It's a very different conversation. Well, we have to accept that free speech. We need to allow people to have free speech,
Yeah.
but there is lines to be crossed where it goes from free speech to potential abuse and it not being acceptable. And I think that for me, it's about officers providing that guidance and support to councillors where, you know, if it happens, you know, you've got officers to talk to about it, and there's a process there in terms of what to do and what not to do in that circumstances as well, because it's very easy to react. It can be very easy to react, and you shouldn't do that. You should maybe take advice, maybe look at the policy, seek support, and then see what the next steps would be. And that's where I think this could really assist. Is there any other comments, Peter?
Well, just to say, I think the City Council does have a responsibility towards its councillors, actually, to give them as much guidance and support as possible. There's new areas, social media, and I think the best practice guide seems to me jolly good in terms of a basic statement. I suspect, however, as Councillor Graves has been saying, the actual operation of social media practice can throw up all sorts of detailed issues, problems, and I suspect therefore that the actual training on the basis of this will be very helpful for councillors. Many will have already worked out how to deal with things, but I suspect particularly the new ones, it would be particularly helpful to have practical training on the basis of the overall policy.
Thank you, Peter. So I assume that is officers' intention to have whatever, whether it's called a policy or guidance document, that it would form part of that, or all of it would form part of the induction process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important. I think there are some people within the council who we can draw upon, certainly within our communications and marketing team, who might be able to assist with that kind of thing in terms of engagement with members of the public online, because they encounter similar situations to those that you face as councillors when engaging with people. Emily, did you want to?
Really, it was just to build on that point, the same point really that Peter made. Yes, I think you're right that as councillors, in the same way that senior officers, we do have to have quite broad shoulders, don't we? It's part of the role, and but at the same time, I think it's important that we have base guidance in place, because there have, you know, were things to come out of hand. I think that we'd be looked at and say, well, what did you do, Derby City Council, as a standards committee, as the monitoring officer, to make sure that councillors were equipped, the guidance was there if they needed it, and we could point to it. And so I think that's very important. I would also say that whilst we can say we should have broad shoulders and all of those things do sometimes go wrong. Things can take a more sinister turn, and it's important that I think councillors know when to read some of the signs there, when things might be going too far in any one direction. And also I think that it's important for me to provide that reassurance that actually where we have seen abuse towards an officer online that has gone beyond what would be acceptable, we have had success with the police in terms of the police being very quick to act to address what has crossed the line in terms of moved into the criminal domain. So whilst, yes, put yourself out there as a councillor, you are going to receive some challenge, and I think that's fine. You know, we live in a democracy, free speech and all those things. It's important that councillors do have some guidance which allows them to spot when things are possibly going a bit too far, and know what to do in those circumstances, when they should raise a flag and say, actually, this isn't acceptable.
So maybe part of this then would be, this may fall more in the induction training, in general training, is maybe some examples of those kind of processes to say, well, you know, let's look at this case or this example and what could have been better, at what point should have intervention should have been sought, that kind of thing. So what, I don't necessarily know whether that would fit squarely within a guidance or a policy, but certainly
I think it's those points that Alex said, help with that. And that could, you know, I think it's always helpful to look at worked examples, to have some examples in a guidance note or something like that, which just sort of says, you know, these are the points to be aware of.
Okay. And there's nuances, of course, on the different social media platforms. If you take Facebook for an example, and it's just a general observation, most councillors will have personal pages, which won't be badged as being a councillor. We maybe won't even reference them being a councillor. Then they may have a councillor page, which does do that. Then they may have a local ward page or a political party page for their ward, which they may be part of as an admin or a member or whatever. And under the hood, the residents don't necessarily see individual names. They'll just see the corporate entity, if you like, or the page. So although they're interacting with councillors, if there's 3 councillors in the ward and they're all from the same political party, you don't necessarily know from posts and comments which councillor you're interacting with. So that's a complication, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, then you've got the community pages, which blur lines further. It may have been started by a councillor, or maybe a councillor is involved in it. I don't, you know, there's lots of different things. So how you unravel all of that and what is relevant and what isn't, probably is something to note more and describe and give scenarios with, really. But yeah, I think the Facebook side of things can be very complex, less so than a Twitter or a TikTok or an Instagram account, which is clearly that person. So.
And the thing is, also social media is very powerful, and I don't think any of you would want to be without your social media feeds as well, would you? You know, there's both sides.
Sometimes
I like to sometimes go to web.
I think it's.
I was just thinking that obviously the council has a responsibility. Not everybody has shoulders quite as broad as Alan's done. Alan's, I would suggest. So I think it has a responsibility to councillors who are less used to it than they are and obviously if people see councillor getting abused for all sorts of reasons and it can step too far, goes too far, you can have difficulty getting people to stand as councillors.
Yes.
It's not going to be interactive for any. So it's something that the council has a responsibility to ensure that abuse does not get beyond just verbal abuse. It gets towards intimidation.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole that I looked at that debate, not hate, and obviously that came out in the realms of lots of things with the MPs, David Ames and Joe Cox issues, you know, and obviously things in certain issues can step too far. I'm not suggesting they've got that far here, but quite clearly they haven't touched. But you know, he does have a responsibility to ensure that it doesn't get too far up, beyond a certain stage. And it's not just down to the strength of the individual councillors. That's obviously part of it. But you know, you're not going to stand as a councillor if you're not going to get people abusing it, disagreeing with you. It's going to happen. You agree A, someone else will agree B. You know, it's going to happen. That's life.
Yes, and that's absolutely right, because if unless you stand as independent and you don't have a political affiliation, you know, I think we understand when we're elected, even if you get 50%. Or a little bit more than that, which is a strong mandate, that's 50% of the electorate that actually turned out. And actually, when you look at your the amount of people in your ward that are on the electoral register, it's probably quite small, because a lot of people will disagree with maybe your political party that you're part of, or your political stance, or your manifesto that you stood on. And you're going to get that challenge, and so you should as well. It's not always going to be sweetness and light, and you certainly shouldn't expect everybody to always agree with you, whether it be face to face in a more traditional setting or even online. But it's absolutely right. We've all said it's about when it crosses that line between general debate and disagreements, where it's respectful, and into something else. I think that's where I would certainly ask officers to really look into as well, very strongly, to help councillors and support them. Alan.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Emily said, and it's just made me think about it. I mean, this report here is about protecting councillors about what they put themselves on social media. But you you mentioned about what does the council's responsibility towards councillors to protecting them? Because, you know, you talked about knowing how far people are getting and recognising that. Sometimes you just don't know. You know, if somebody turns up at your surgery and knifes you, you know, there's no protection. You know, I mean, I assume that everybody's going to be okay. You know, they're coming because they want some help, and I'm going to try and help them. I don't assume somebody's coming in to kill me or hurt me or whatever. It doesn't even enter my head. However, on social media, you know, there are times when councillors feel quite desperate because they don't know how to deal with a particular person that's having a go at you constantly, and you don't. And what responsibility has the council got for helping that person? Because I don't think you do anything. I think you just say, well, you know, suck it in, and although you do flower it in different language, but basically you've got to cope with it yourself. So I think we can explore. I'm not criticising. What I'm saying is, let's explore that.
Yeah.
Because I'd like to see something in this document that says councils can be protected if residents and constituents go overboard, and how you can do that. The other thing I wanted to just to share some experience. I mean, I'd forgotten about it until I just thought about it. 12 months ago, I was harassed by a particular lady. She was putting lots of bad things about me on social media. Every particular post, she was putting things about me, and which is okay because you expect it, broad shoulders. But then I went onto a particular site. It was a hidden site that she was on. And I picked it up and I had a look and I joined them. They didn't know who I was. I joined them, and she was inciting people to make complaints about me, not to people in Derby, but to people all over the country. To write into Derby City Council and complain about me. And I thought, well, now you've gone a bit too far. You know, I mean, you're asking people that don't know anything about me. She knows me, but these other people have no idea who I am. And just because she doesn't like me, she's trying to make other people not like me. All right. And so I made a complaint to the police for harassment. And the police went round and she shut up. So there are avenues that you can take.
Which is the point about those examples that I think would be useful for officers as to doing the right thing and the process that you can follow. What I would say, Alan, and I'll come to Emily shortly, is there's been something recently in my councillor cohort, and actually Alex was very supportive. So there are mechanisms there, and I've found that officers will be very responsive and supportive in terms of advice and taking some action. But obviously we can do more, and I'm sure that this is part of that process. Emma.
And I think so there is a slight difference, isn't there, between our duty of care as an employer towards our employees, and councillors aren't employees. That said, we do accept that we have responsibilities in terms of giving you resources to make sure that you have tools to deploy in terms of being safe online, all of those things. Obviously, we look to share guidance from the LGA that's issued in relation to safety and all of those things. It is a slightly different relationship, the council relationship, to the employee-employer relationship, and it's a different duty. That said, we do look to try and be supportive, and sometimes I've stepped in. So there has been occasions where I have seen examples of councillors having to put up with significant abuse from residents in relation to campaigns, for example, and where I think councillors have been reluctant to say enough is enough. And actually, I've had to step in and say, you know what? It's really laudable, quite how reasonable you are being here, councillor. But I have witnessed what you've been subject to, and enough is enough, actually. No, we're not going to accommodate these individuals any further. We will put in communicate, and we have assisted members with communication plans, all of those things. So we will look to take proactive steps if requested, and we do. I think, Alex, I don't know if you want to build on that.
That was exactly the point I was going to make, Emily, in that there are councillors shouldn't feel that they are helpless if they are the subject of intimidation, abuse, or a persistent campaign from an individual. There are levels to that sort of that abuse. If it's just repeated emails raising casework. Yes, it's very irritating, but it's probably not harassment or intimidation. We would, as officers, could put in place a communications plan with that resident. We've had some success doing that in the past. It doesn't always work, sadly, but we will do what we can to put in place a plan. It's exactly as members have already described. It's about knowing when that irritation passes a certain threshold, when it becomes harassment or when it takes a sinister turn, when there are threats of violence and intimidation, who you need to go to, who you need to speak to, whether that's within the council or at the police. And there are, Emily will be able to speak to this better than I can, but there are legal remedies that you can seek. There are councils that seek injunctions against residents that prevent them from contacting individuals or contacting the council, but those responses have to be proportionate to the extent of the abuse or the intimidation or whatever we described as. But I think that's what this protocol should capture, is at those low levels, what do you do? When it progresses to something more serious, what do you do? And then when it gets really serious, who is it that you go and speak to at the police? What are the legal remedies that you have at your disposal?
What services within various political parties for this sort of thing?
I think I can only speak for my group. We would have, your ward colleagues as well, and maybe the whips as well, or any of the longer standing councillors who maybe have more experience. They're always there to ask questions of or gain support from. So, but it would vary between group to group, and obviously different group sizes as well have a different councillor mix in there as well. We may find after all out that maybe groups with significant amount of new councillors, and they may need more support than others in terms of because some of the more experienced councillors, not experienced but long-standing councillors will probably be leaving the fold. So it is a good point actually, but I think that's something which is more internal to each political group, and the council doesn't really have much influence on. However, this could feed into that process in terms of the actual Derby City recognised Derby City Council groups, the political groups. Maybe they can feed in and can actually offer some guidance on internal processes as well, and internal support, not just with officers.
We would reference that. I think we would put in that guidance. Speaking to groups,
nominate an individual in each group as a sort of a pastoral responsibility, I guess, to
So for an independence.
Yeah.
Well,
It's not a single.
Absolutely, yes.
No, it is. But although our independents are currently grouped.
Almost like a champion within the group. Like they have champions within the council. So
Just one slide. I had a quick look at that social media policy for employees. Apart from the fact it's 3 years out of date and could do with reviewing. It's not been reviewed since May 19.
okay.
It does have some fairly good common sense things in there, which could be incorporated with. You're not going to adopt the whole thing on block. It wouldn't be appropriate. It has some very common sense things in there, which I think could be merged into something for the councillors as well. Yeah. It just make sense to get them as not reinvent the wheel. You use what we've got already.
I mean, obviously, there is a difference between employees of the council and elected members. There is a difference, but obviously, some of those policies could actually be cross-referenced and used. I'm sure. Yeah. Certainly, leave that with officers as well. I think it's as we draw this one to a close. I think the recommendations are sound. As Alex has said, it's deliberately sort of open-ended a little bit to actually get that piece of work done. But I think it's important to say, although we are focusing on interaction on social media, the vast majority of interactions are positive. I think that in my experience, even when you maybe can't resolve a query or a question or an issue in exactly the right way, in an outcome that the resident probably would see as perfect solution can always be done, as long as it's done in a respectful way, I think, and on both sides, then there isn't any issues. But in a minority of cases, then it can escalate into something which is something entirely different to that. And I think that's what we're talking about here, apart from just general guidance.
Chair, let's be honest, it's only a very, very small proportion of minority who do this. It's not the general public. It's less than 1%, but unfortunately, it does stick with people. So it's not a great cause of concern, but it's just how you
Exactly.
manage it.
Yeah.
And my advice was don't get into a spat because you're never going to win.
No, that's right.
Simple.
And also the message to residents who may be watching this live or on a recording is we're not trying to hide away here or put policy in front of interaction on social media between councillors and residents.
Yeah.
You know, and we're not complaining about that. It's important to say that we're talking about guidance for councillors to make that a positive thing, but also when things don't go right or there is abuse on a very small amount of occasions, we need to obviously ensure that everybody understands what the process is and what guidance and support there would be for those situations. Certainly not trying to put a blanket over it and look after us and try and protect us from scrutiny, because that's definitely not the case. Okay, so moving on, item 7 is volumes and outcomes of councillor complaints. Is it Emily or Alex? Is it Emily?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Chair. The report pretty much speaks for itself. It sets out where we are in terms of the current complaints that we have, and also how ones from previous municipal years have been resolved. Obviously, we do have an item on the confidential part of the agenda. If there are any questions that councillors have this?
Okay, problem. So we move on. Is this where we move to the yes agenda where we have to stop the broadcast?
You have to read the names.
Okay.
Agenda.
So,
It's made.
thank you. Okay, so item 8, exclusion of press in public. To consider a resolution to exclude the press and public during consideration of the following items: that under section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972, the press and the public be excluded from the meeting during discussion of the following items on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraphs 1 and 2 of part 1 of the schedule 12A of the Act, and that the public interest in maintaining the exception outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. Thank you.